Good evening. A warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Children, Families and Education Select Committee. My name is Councillor Heena Makwana and I'm the chair of this committee. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. We are not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch any mobile devices to silent before the meeting starts. And when you're invited to speak, please ensure you turn your microphones on so that you can be heard in the recording. For those watching via YouTube, if you're so minded, you can complete one of our resident feedback forms. These can be found in the information section underneath the YouTube video. These forms are intended to help us improve the way that we run our meetings. Before we go through the agenda, I'd like to introduce officers in the room and our colleagues. So we've got Councillor Becky Hagger, Smallwood and Banerjee to my right. To my left, I have Ryan Dell, Democratic Services Officer, Councillors Sweeting, Judge and Gill, Mr Tony Little, our co-opted member, officers presenting this evening, Abby Preston, Nav Minas, Richard Woodfin, Catherine Angelini and Sally Edwards. So welcome to you all. Okay, let's move on to agenda item 1. Apologies for absence, please.
Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Batt with Councillor Banerjee substituting.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Banerjee, for subbing this evening. Item 2, declarations of interest in matters coming before this meeting. Do we have any? No, thank you very much. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Councillor Sweeting.
Oh, as usual, the minutes are excellent. But one point, page 9 said that the opposition lead will be consulted about the comments going to Cabinet. I did not receive any of those comments. I have double-checked all my emails, and although we provided some written comments, they were not included, so I don't quite know what happened there.
Your comments were received. Some of the points were included, but it's Chairman's prerogative, isn't it? So.
Yes, but I wasn't consulted on the final version of what was going to Cabinet.
Okay. Agenda item 4, to confirm that the items of business marked in part 1 will be considered in public and that the items marked in part 2 will be considered in private. There are no part 2 items. That moves us on to agenda item 5, which is the school organisation plan. Is that over to you, Abby and Nav? Yes. Okay. Okay, great, thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. So we are bringing the school organisation plan to committee for comments. We're really pleased to be able to bring this item. This has been something that I think will be really useful for our schools, something that they're really looking forward to being able to use and work with, and help them to be able to plan around pupil numbers and ensure that they're looking at all the projections and using that in their sort of strategic plans moving forward. So I'll hand over to Nav, who can talk you through a bit more detail.
Thank you. So this report presents to committee a draft school organisation plan for Hillingdon. It acknowledges the statutory duty that the local authority has to ensure sufficiency of school places for all of its residents, and it's presented in 3 sections: introduction, context and strategy. The sections themselves provide an overview of the education landscape in Hillingdon, a summary of current pupil numbers and projected demands in primary, secondary provision, as well as specialist places, and the options for the local authority to consider when determining the need to increase or reduce school places. Like Abby's mentioned, this is the first time that we're actually presenting this information in this particular format, and welcome any questions and comments on it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Just my first initial thoughts, it's really comprehensive, and I know that a lot of hard work and effort's gone into that, so thank you very much for bringing this to committee. Questions? Councillor Hagger.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. It's a really good report, very comprehensive, and I think it would be really good for the parents when we come in. Mine is on page 12 of the report, or page 26. And it's just about the scaping and how we're placing it. I just wondered, is this enough reduction? Because when we looked at the numbers, we can see that the places aren't being taken up, so they're going to be lesser from nursery as it goes into the schools. And I noticed the pound reduction is 30 places and then another 30 places. I just wondered whether we're confident that that's enough, or should we have more? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that question. What officers do on a regular basis is review the census information, so obviously that's termly. Alongside that, we look at the preference data as well, and obviously leading up to the National Officer Day for primary in April, as well as the secondary National Officer Day that's just taken place, alongside having conversations with our schools. That is key. It's not something that happens once a term. We want to have these continued conversations. The pupil role has been declining in our primaries, as everyone is aware, and obviously there's pressure in our secondary phase, and obviously as those year groups age up and out into secondary, that will obviously impact those numbers as well. With regards to PAN reductions, the issue is that they're not always concentrated in a particular school. So we can't say, well, there's a definite, 30 in that particular school. It does happen, and therefore we've got a strong case to support the school in that PAN reduction. But sometimes they're scattered, and therefore we can monitor and support that school with our education advisors and the admissions team and see how we can manage that. But unfortunately, it's not a case that we can, like we did a couple of years ago, and which took effect this September gone, where we had 9 PAN reductions. It's not something that we can do as a norm. These are in conversations with our schools, and it doesn't matter if they're maintained or academies. We do actually treat them the same. They are our schools and obviously our children, so we are responsible for them. But again, we've recently sent out communication to our schools that we're concerned about, and we are waiting to hear back. But I think those conversations will probably take place after Easter, when schools will want to know what the process is and what we can do to support them even further with that. So,
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
Well, I very much welcome this report. It's something that I've been asking for some time. In fact, when I asked for it to be put on the agenda, I thought it was just going to be a sort of generic discussion about the school organisation plan and the statutory requirement. I believe that this is the first one that's been published for a number of years. I remember when I did the one for Hillingdon way back. I don't think we've actually published one since then. So I'm interested in knowing why now, because we have put in significant numbers of primary places in the past, and we've also had the pressure on secondary places. So why is it now? Is it got something to do with the fact that for the very first time we are confronted with significant need to reduce primary capacity? We've already done quite a few reductions in PAN of our primary schools, but it is the reason that it informs our schools and others that is in the pipeline, because it surprised me that we haven't completed one of these for consultation, because I know when this one was completed, it was consulted, our schools were consulted, and neighbouring boroughs were consulted. So I don't know why it's now rather than some years ago when we were expanding our primary places.
Thank you, Councillor. Firstly, my understanding is, Nav can correct me if I'm wrong, that there isn't a statutory requirement anymore, but this is more of a good practice. So I think the reason why now, this is something that we've been talking about for some time, and I think it's about the timing with our other strategies that we're putting in place. So we've got our Send an AP strategy, which links closely to this. We're in the process of building an education strategy, and I think it's just the order of pulling everything together so it all talks the same language. I think there is mounting pressure around the primary places and the knock-on effect that's going to have with secondaries. And I think it's just the perfect time, really, to be able to tie this in with the other work that we're doing and be able to ensure that our schools have all the data and information that we can provide so that they're in the strongest place to be able to make appropriate plans.
Please, Chair. I'm surprised that the Council council is using quite a simplistic way of planning secondary places. When the school organisation plan was statutory, we consulted our head teachers, and the message coming back very loud and clear from our secondary heads was it was a very complex business in that middle area of the borough. And so we had the 3 secondary planning areas: North, Central East, Central West. And that gave a much more sort of detailed idea of where the pressure is, because what's happened is that we've separated North and South, and the North looks as if it's got pressure, but in fact the pressure is coming from that middle band. So will the officers look at least at what was right in the past on planning secondary places? Because I do think it gives a much better, a clearer definition of where the pressure is and where the pressure has been. I mean, certainly the move-ins to the borough show where the pressure is, and that is in that band at the centre as well as south. It's not in the north. So could I sort of suggest that we at least look at that, please?
Thank you, Councillor. My understanding is that any changes to planning areas has to go through the SCAP process as well, so any changes would have to be requested. Happy to have that conversation with the relevant parties, but I do believe the suggestion that was made previously was rejected, but happy to go back and have that conversation. Thank you.
Mr. Little.
Thank you. Thank you for this report, which has been said by others is quite full and gives us plenty to get our teeth into. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the forecasting process that goes into the numbers, and what sort of error margin is there around the longer term aspects of that forecast?
Thank you. I think I would have to ask our data colleagues to come back and respond to that question. It's not something that I'm aware of. They obviously have the formulas that they use, the recommendations by the GLA, and year on year the data team decides on the best possible formula for that year's projections. Obviously it's something that they're very confident in. I don't believe that there's ever been a variance of more than 3%, to my knowledge, on the projections that have been made. But happy to come back to committee with that information.
I'm sure you're right about the short-term forecasts, and a lot of the short-term is kind of built in, but there's bound to be an error margin around the longer-term forecasts here, because all sorts of things, as we saw with COVID, can happen in that interim period. But on the assumption that these are realistic equations that you've used, and the numbers are good central estimates of what's happened, on what sort of timescale would we need to be looking at changing the secondary school capacity to match with the surplus that's obviously going to build up towards the end of the period?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
As you move out in terms of years, there is a surplus building up in the secondary schools. At some point, that will require action, changing the capacities of the schools, or some schools. And what sort of timescale would we need to be thinking about that? When would we need to be saying these are the schools that we need to do something about?
Thank you, and for clarifying as well. Well, we're currently doing that anyway, because we know with our projections that we have that the numbers are going to plateau in the coming year. and therefore beyond that they will start to reduce it, or the schools will reduce in their pupil numbers. We've already started to kind of analyse that information, the data that's coming through, and what we want to do is to do what we've done similar to in our primary schools, is to be able to use that surplus capacity to provide specialist places for our pupils. So we've had a series of SEND projects in our primary sector. What we want to do and what we aim to do is provide or mirror that in our secondary sector as well. So we would be looking for specialist provision.
Okay, Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you, Chair. Again, a very, very thorough report, and I think this is far better having this once a year than having it twice a year, where it's a bit distorted. I'm a lot happy with this now. It's been incredibly helpful to me. I just wanted to understand a little bit about how decisions are made on reducing the PAN. There's obviously, and I'm going to be a bit crude and just use some very simple numbers here, but I recognise it's a little bit more complicated. If you had 65 pupils in a year group, right, with a form entry of 3, whilst I don't want overcrowded classrooms, there is obviously a huge financial pressure on running three classrooms. Now, we can already see we have excellent teachers in Hillingdon. You know, in the last 10 years, we have seen a massive increase in the amount of good and outstanding schools, which is a credit to our teachers throughout Hillingdon. But I just wanted to understand how we work on the fine margins with schools to try and address some of that, because I am certainly getting feedback from a school where I'm a governor and from other schools where it is tight on whether it reduces it, and then having to hire that extra teacher and that extra classroom assistant, and how we're tackling those ones on the margins where there is that big financial pressure.
I think it's a really difficult thing to kind of perfect in a way, because there is a process with reducing PAN and it's not immediate. We work with our schools and keep those conversations open around understanding what's working for them and where there's challenges. It also depends on the year groups, because obviously it's much tighter for Key Stage 1. You can't go over your numbers, whereas Key Stage 2 you can be more flexible, for example. So a school might take 65 children and say we'll split those into 2 classes, and that would be viable, whereas if it's Key Stage 1 you can't do that. So some of the things we try and do as well is to look at informal caps where we can support schools with that, and obviously that is informal, so if the demand comes in we would need to use their full PAN, but we try to use tools like that to support schools in the interim, because it isn't an immediate solution, but it's just about keeping those conversations open and working closely with our schools, trying to think creatively around how we can support them. And as we've said before, it's really important that we can have flexible kind of solutions, because those numbers can change in the future and we might have that demand again. So it's just having those close conversations and trying to work together to find interim solutions as well as the kind of longer term ones.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that answer. I'd also just wanted to address, thinking 20, 30 years down the line, none of us have any idea around, how people are going to make babies, right? So, or where they're going to live, or the cost of living, or we're going to have another global pandemic. None of us can predict these things, right? What are our plans for, a 10-year plan for either upscaling to, increase PAN, or possibly even a further decreasing of PAN, potential maybe closure of schools, or keeping schools open just in case, not just in case, with the potential that we may have to use the buildings and use them more because we've got an increase in pupils. I know that's another complicated one, but what are the long-term forecasting in around that?
It's a really difficult one, because anything can happen, and I think having a plan like this gives us a longer-term view on where we're looking to go and what the direction of travel is likely to be. But we wouldn't want to be making big decisions on long-term projections, because we wouldn't want to be putting the council in financial risk, etc. So I think having a document like this is really helpful, because it gives us some sort of real forward-thinking sort of data and tools to be able to work with. But updating this each year to be able to see how those projections are coming out and if they're changing over time will be really important. And I think just keeping that conversation with our schools going so that they have as much information as they possibly can have. But again, it's about that kind of flexible system because, you know, pupil numbers are falling at the moment. That could completely change in 5-10 years. And what we don't want to do is make any kind of big decisions that mean costly, challenging scenarios in future to overturn that and have to rebuild schools because we've gone too far with kind of reducing our PAMs. So I think that flexible approach is really important. But just starting with a document where we've got all this information, I hope will be really helpful, both for the council and our schools and our families to kind of understand the pressures and demands and look at creative ways of sort of supporting our schools.
Okay, Councillor Gill.
Thank you, Chair, and I must thank the officers for such a comprehensive report. I think just reading through it was quite informative. Just on page 5, just had a quick question around, I think we've become a net exporter of students to neighbouring boroughs. I was wondering if it would be useful to just show on a map exactly where the pressures are in our borough, so we can highlight that. It's more of a request than anything. Would that be possible in the final report?
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
I know that there was the issue that was just been raised by another member concerning, you know, possible future spare capacity in secondaries. But as page 19 states, each of our primary year groups, the number of bottoms on the seats in each of those primary year groups is more than the capacity that we've got in year 7. So I think it's still going to be some time before that unwinds. But I would like to take in issue with table 3 on page, it's got 2 page numbers here just to confuse everybody, page 9 or page 23, because it's looking again at the spare capacity, and we know that we've got spare capacity in our primaries, we know that we've got a lack of capacity in our specials, but we're working on that. But what concerns me is how much we are saying we've got capacity in our secondaries. Because if you look at that 5.6%, it's nowhere near the 8% of wriggle room that we say we need. But in fact, that 5.6% includes bulge classes. If you take out the bulge classes, we have got a mere 1.38% of wriggle room. Now, bulge classes are not statutory classes. So, I mean, my question is, when are we going to be able to have enough wriggle room to enable move-ins, for example, to have at least a chance of getting a school place? Because we know from the Fair Access panel that there's real problems with move-ins and finding a school place. And I think unless we start recognising that we are much under what the Ofsted and Department for Education recognises is reasonable wriggle room, then we're still going to have issues relating to move-ins and others, including asylum seekers, etc. So what are we actually doing to keep up with this 8% wriggle room? Because I can't see that it's happening. Are we going to ask the bulge classes, those schools with bulge classes, to become permanent capacity increases? Because that then at least will give us the 5.6% that you're registering on that table. Because otherwise we have not got 5.6% statutory wriggle room. We've got a lot less than that.
Thank you, Councillor. I'd just like to, and maybe it needs to be clearer, but just bring your attention to the note just under that table. It actually does exclude the bulge places. So that is, the difference is correct. It is 5.6%.
But the bulge classes are not statutory.
No, but that 5.6 number doesn't include the bulge classes. So this is... No, it does.
Well, if you look at one of the agenda items, if you look at one of the agenda items and multiply the number of year 7 places by the 5 statutory years, it doesn't make that figure.
We did ask the data team to triple check that, and they did. So I'm happy to go back to them and to confirm that. But my understanding is that is without the secondary bulge classes.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Smallwood.
Chair, I have a question, but I've just become a little bit confused. So, just to be clear, that does not include the bulge classes. That is a 5.6% wiggle room that we have within our schools in the borough. Okay, thank you. I've just got myself a little bit confused. I just wanted to pick up on something very specific. And I know you're not meant to do things in your own ward, but it happens to be in my ward. It's PPA 3. Interestingly, on this specific one, there's a massive surplus in this academic year, and then actually it drops quite dramatically, which doesn't really happen across any others. There's a couple where there's a bit of a drop, but actually we're actually seeing the surplus drop, it's almost the reverse of what we've discussed. And I just wondered if there was something specific to that area and why we see quite a dramatic drop. It goes from 52 all the way down to 9 in 6-7 years' time. I just wondered if you want to write to me and explain it to me, that's absolutely fine. I know that's quite a technical question, but it's the only one where there is a massive drop rather than a plateauing or an increase.
Thank you. This is where, while the top line is absolutely correct, I believe that there has been double counting for the PAN reductions in the 24-25 column. Underneath that line was, whereas the top line is what we've submitted for our SCAP return last year, the bottom line I asked to be included to help show the decrease or increase year on year to make it easier for councillors, but I believe that that's where there is a difference of 30 in that particular column, because there are 2 PAN reductions that will come into effect this year, but it's infant and junior, and this is just reception. So thank you very much.
Okay, Councillor Hagger.
Thank you. Just a final question, actually. I really love the way we have very simply put in here how we're going to deal with a lot of the issues, whether it's low numbers or too many. But particularly on page 14 or page 28, depending on which way you're looking at it, it's really good to see that we've got vacant caretaker properties for, obviously, the children with SAND, additional provisions. Are there any timescales on that? Is there any dates that that we're targeting for? We've got on here that we've already actively identified the vacant properties, but what is that looking time-wise? It's a really, it's a great thing that we've found them.
So we haven't got any specific timelines per se at the moment, partly because we're just starting to sort of enter those conversations. And it's another way of supporting schools financially at the moment, whilst also helping with some other council objectives. So it's an ongoing conversation. So some of those schools we've spoken to aren't ready to look at that conversation, which is totally understandable. But it might be in the next couple of years that that's something that becomes more important for them. So we're just having it as an ongoing plan.
Thank you.
Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. And, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is a really good report and, I appreciate the detail. I just wanted to double-click actually on something that Councillor Gill said on page 21 or page 35 of the report. Could you just shed a bit more light on how the Council have been working hard to reduce the number of children in INMSS provision? And I'd also like to know if it's possible to get the information on children being sent outside of the borough who have SEND needs as well, because, again, just anecdotally, residents have come to me who've moved from primary to secondary education, and the school's far away now. They have to take, tubes and buses to get there, so that's, quite difficult for them to manage. I'm just keen to understand, how many children are actually having to go outside the borough who have special sort of education needs, so that'd be useful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. So we can come back to you with that data. I think it's fair to say it's a really important target for us at the moment, and it sits within our SEND and AP strategy as a key strand. We know that it's really important for our children with SEND to be educated in their local community for a whole range of reasons, but you've touched on one key one, which is around transport. We don't want our children having to travel a long way to get to school and back when already, that's incredibly tiring and stressful for them to have to do. But it's also about those social groups so that they're in school with children that they can mix with in their community. So this has been a big project for us. We've been looking at our SEND provision, and I think tying in your question around in-MIS or independent placements, that's another reason why we want to make sure we have enough maintained local settings. So our building projects are developing and moving forward. Stage one of that, if you like, is the SRPs and designated units that we've pretty much finished in the most part, apart from one or two that are just finishing or slightly delayed. But that's increasing our capacity around children accessing mainstream but with specialist sort of input. I think we're doing work in every aspect of our SEND system at the moment, so we're really getting under the skin of everything we do and how we do it. So as part of that, we're starting as well at sort of special schools, looking at admissions criteria, so we have really clear sort of framework around which schools provide support for the right sort of needs, so that the children that are going special are going to the right special schools, and broadening our spectrum of support and provision within mainstream as well. So that is going to have a much bigger impact. As those building projects complete, we're going to have more places within Borough, but we do have quite a high level of special school places, believe it or not, compared to national in Hillingdon. So we don't also want to overbuild and create too many schools because you will always fill them, and that's not necessarily what's right for our children. So I know that's quite a sort of long-winded answer, but we are looking at every element of that, and like I said, it's really important within our strategy that our children can attend their local schools with their local communities and support their development through doing that. So it's a big priority for us at the moment.
Thank you, Abby. And I think just on the back of that, what you were talking about admissions criteria, so I believe that there's a guidance going to be produced as well, which I think will be really useful for especially parents and carers to understand kind of what is required for a special school place. I did have a question about assessment and how exactly are pupils assessed in terms of determining their level of educational provision that they might need.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. So that comes through, if we're talking about EHCPs, that comes through the assessment process. So children would generally have an educational psychologist assess them that can give us really detailed sort of assessments and an understanding of their need and provision required. That's often supplemented with things like a speech and language therapist report or occupational therapy. We look at sort of medical reports and pull that all together to form a plan that's shaped around those professional reports to make sure we meet need. So that's where, I mean, as I said, we're doing so much with SEND. I know I've talked to you all about it a lot already, and I could talk to you all day about it, but we really are setting up sort of frameworks around everything we're doing, so we've got a real standardised sort of approach to everything. So the special schools guidance will be really important. We're also going to be doing some videos of our maintained special schools, because it's really difficult for our parents to access them because it's a really difficult environment to go for visits when the children have lots of different needs. It can be quite disruptive, but also so that our families can understand, well, what's the school like and what sort of children do they cater for and what sort of support's in place. So I think that's going to be really important. And it's just making sure that then we, along with our banding review, which I've talked about before, and that's important not just from a financial perspective, but that's important from being able to really classify children's needs, if you like. So having a real sort of standardised approach to the type of needs and the provision that goes with that, and then finally the finances that can support those things. And all that work will help us to more accurately project need as well in the future. So once we have that system in place and we've applied that to our children that we have in the system now, we'll have a much better way of being able to categorise these needs coming through and making sure not just the number of special school places that we have are appropriate, but that the needs are appropriate as well. So there's lots of work going on that will help us, I think, a long way in the future to make sure we have everything lined up the way we want it to be, and so we can meet those needs.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
Well, like a good retired primary school teacher, I've done my sums, and if you look at Appendix 4, you will see that the total PAN for our secondaries is 3722. If you multiply that by 5, it doesn't come to 19,450, but it comes to what I said was 18,610. So that 5.6% includes bulge classes.
So the appendix that you referred to, Councillor, 12, 13, sorry, 6.
It's got all of the secondary schools listed, published admission numbers, excluding bulge classes. There it is, 3722 is the total capacity.
What page, sorry?
It's Appendix 4. Appendix 4. Yes, Appendix 4, with the primaries on one page and then the secondaries on the next page. So you've got all of our secondaries listed there, with excluding bulge 3722. If you multiply that by 5, it comes to 18,610.
Okay. So the PAN is absolutely right. It's 3722. The October census figures that have been provided, I have been advised doesn't exclude excludes the secondary PAN, but what it does do is include the studio and the UTCs as the capacity. But what I can do is provide a breakdown for each of those settings for you. That's absolutely fine. But that is the information that we've got from our data team. They have said that the figures absolutely do not include the bulge classes, but what we have done is include studio and UTCs as the figures as per the funding agreement for those provisions.
Now, may I suggest that you have a look and perhaps consult with the data team and then just provide the committee with
a breakdown?
That would be, yeah, thank you very much. We can just do that. Thank you. Any more questions? No. Oh, Councillor Judge.
Thank you, Chair. What I would like to know is that it's referring to Table 4 on page 10. It mentions that the inadequate rating which Ofsted placed on one of our special schools. I mean, is there an update on how the school is performing, and has Ofsted, revisited the school since this rating?
Are you talking about the school that's since converted since the...
Yes.
Yeah, so it's no longer classified as inadequate because it's closed and reopened as a new school. So there is a monitoring scheme in place with the DFE that we support as well. But because it's a new school, it's ungraded. But that provision is monitored.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Great, okay, we can bring this agenda item to a close. So just to remind ourselves of the recommendations, we need to note and provide comments to Cabinet on this draft plan and agree to update. So the committee agrees that we'll be updated annually by officers with the latest data and forecasts. So thank you very much. Nav, thank you, and we'll look forward to receiving follow-up information in due course. You're free to stay or go, or are you staying? You're staying. Okay, great. Right, so we move on to agenda item 6, which is the annual education standards report. Is that you, Richard?
That's me. Good evening, everyone. I do apologise for being
I just do that? Okay, there we go. Would you like me to introduce it? Right, okay. Please excuse me, first time I've ever done this. It's very different to being a head teacher in some ways. Right, okay, so welcome, and obviously thank you for giving me the opportunity to step into Michael's shoes. I will do my best to answer any questions you have. Obviously, if I can't, then I will go away and find the answer and bring it back to you. It's been a complete privilege from my position to actually have the opportunity to do this, having spent 20 years as a head teacher and over 30 years in education in London, and now the opportunity at the end of my career to actually see it from the other side. It is absolutely fascinating, and it's a privilege to work with such talented colleagues as well. So in terms of the report that Michael has produced, in a nutshell, I think there is work to do around Key Stage 4 outcomes and definitely work to do around Key Stage 5 outcomes. There is a healthy growth in primary, and there is some work still to do in early years as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you. I think the overall picture is a good one. I think I'd just like to understand a little bit about some of the differentiations between England and London partners on Key Stage 5, given there's such a difference between Key Stage 1, 2 and 3, where actually we're pretty much there, and in some places actually Hillingdon outperforms, but there's not much difference. That's question one. And then the other one is in and around early years and foundation settings and the good level of development, which I don't know whether people call it the GLD, but I will. What is the massive increase of 4.9% based on between 2022 and 2023? And that's quite a big increase, which then gets us above both the national, within literally touching distance of the London.
Can you point me to the page or the table?
46 on mine. I don't know what that is on the overall. Yeah. 45, 46 on mine. Sorry, I'm dealing with it online and not on
118.
They're not blue on mine, unfortunately.
Okay. Table on page 118. Okay.
Top one says GLD 63 to 68, 63.8%, 68%,
Yeah.
4.9%.
Okay. Well, that's the overall figure that schools have assessed their children reaching the end of the foundation stage, being assessed on the indicators that will indicate a good level of development through the foundation stage. So that plus 4.9 is obviously a year-on-year increase in terms of where schools are assessing their children are finishing now.
I guess my question is, why is it such a big increase?
Well, I think you've got to look at, we're coming off the back of COVID, we're coming off the back of the pandemic, we're settling things down, we're getting back to where we were. I think schools, are working effectively with the children in the early years. I think there's good support from our early years colleagues to support schools. I think it's a picture that will continue to grow. Because obviously one has to focus very much on the early years if one has to then stop what's happening in Key Stage 4 and 5 later on down the line. And I think the more input that you can put into early years, the better the whole picture will be.
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
Yes, it's a very detailed report, and I think the nub of the issue is on page 117. I know it's got another number, 45, but here we go. I think this is a really good way of expressing the information that we need as a scrutiny committee. And I think it's got to be recognised that things have improved in our primary sector. However, there are still challenges. Just by looking at those graphs, and it's very good that we're having it printed in colour, otherwise we'd be doomed really, wouldn't we? And we see that early years we're very much sort of in line with our statistical neighbours, outer London boroughs. But we're not when it comes to Key Stage 1, so we're lower than both our statistical neighbours and our outer London boroughs. I know that our position in London boroughs has improved because at one point last year we were 28th out of 32 London boroughs in one measure. And when it comes to Key Stage 2, again, there's our line, the first line, and we are lower again than outer London boroughs and statistical neighbours. So we've still got challenges there. My concern, though, is looking at Key Stage 4 and 5, because there's no doubt, looking at where we are, especially with Key Stage 5, that there are real challenges there. And because most of our secondaries are academies, and I know the Regional Schools Commissioner is all part of this, so what are we doing as a council to challenge the Regional Schools Commissioner that can challenge our secondary schools and bring them up to a level that at least we're on parity with our statistical neighbours? I mean, we're always sort of towards the bottom, 9th out of 11. I mean, really, it is of concern. So I'm turning the tables on the council, saying, what are we doing to challenge the Regional Schools Commissioner, who might be able to challenge our secondary schools, to bring us up to some sort of level?
I think there's a few things to actually bear in mind here. I think that the one thing that Michael and I discuss quite a lot is that whole thing around school-to-school support, peer support with schools, and I know that's a very active, ongoing strategy at the moment. It's the use of the Hillingdon Secondary Heads Association, and that is an active tool where we are trying to actively disseminate best practice and for schools to work with schools. We're also obviously in communication with our colleagues in the academy sector as well, and Michael, in his capacity as the Secondary School Improvement Advisor, makes numerous trips in and out of various schools, talking to them about their priorities and where they are. The other thing in my mind is the readiness possibly of the children taking those exams, and I think it also is something that you then have to trace back to the foundations earlier in the educational journey, and perhaps we are seeing now in Hillingdon the impact of the previous few years, and also capacity and instability in previous times that are now coming through in Key Stage 4 and 5. The whole thing around the flexibility of the cohorts as well, children moving in and out of the local authority, lack of capacity and consistency in older children's lives, influence of socio-economic factors on young adults. That it's a complicated picture, and I think you also have to look at young adults' mental health as well, which in my experience as a head teacher is an overarching concern, not only for our children moving off into young adulthood and into the world of work, Key Stage 4 and 5, but obviously that has to be then supported and developed and tracked very thoroughly from earlier on in the educational journey. So I feel it's a complicated picture from my perspective, and the communications that Michael and I have about it. I do feel that we are active in trying to address that, but undoubtedly I'm not going to sit here and try and justify the fact there isn't work to do, because there certainly is work to do, and I think the element of consistency in my mind is key to that.
No, we've got a microphone. Just to follow up on that. Sorry, a little bit logistical. I think Richard raises some really valid points, and we know the trends over time have been that our schools in early years achieve really well, and it's kind of gone downhill as the key stages go up. And that's something we're really aware of, and I think the point around the historic achievement coming through the system is an important point. But I think it's also really important to note that the differences between us and statistical neighbours are very, very minimal in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. And Key Stage 4 we have come a long way with. I remember a few years ago that was more of an area of concern, but we've really made progress with that. So I would hope, as the cohorts move through the system, the impact of all that work over the years feeds through, and we start to see more progress in Key Stage 5 as well. But it is a really important area, and something we're continuing to work on. We have regular conversations with the DFE, part of the Regional Director's Office to work with them around our different settings that are academies. So we will continue that work. There's also a lot of work around the sort of 14 to 19 space as well, which I think will be really important in making sure our children are studying the topics they're interested in, which will help them in the long term if they're fully aware of their options. So we have things like our post-16 digital brochure, which is aimed for our children to be able to use and select their options. So there's lots of things going on, and like with anything, it's not something that's going to change overnight, but it's really positive that we're seeing that growth in Key Stage 4, and we're hoping that that will continue through to Key Stage 5.
Thank you. Councillor Hagger.
Thank you. I'm going to go back a bit to early years and foundation stage. So we're coming back onto page 78. I was looking at the requires improvement and inadequate, and I just got a little bit confused with the chart. So the first question I've got is, we've got the table that says requires improvement 1 and inadequate 2. This is on page 78. And then on page 79, we've got 4 settings moved from inadequate judgment to good judgment, and 1 setting moved requires improvement. So it doesn't quite tie up the 4, you know, the 1 and the 2 and the... So that was the first bit I just wanted to point out. But really what I wanted to know was not just those figures actually, it was, were the schools that require improvement, and I'm sure they were, but I just wanted to check, they weren't the ones that went down to the inadequate. I presume the inadequate were different. So it's sort of like, okay, the schools come in requires improvement. The next year, hopefully it goes up to good. It's not the same one that has come down to inadequate. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can find out, because we'll have to look at that individual data. Yeah.
Okay.
They are PVI settings, yeah?
Right.
So they are private nurseries, yeah?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gill.
Thank you, Chair. Back to page 117, I think there's been 3 questions on this, and there's another one from me. Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, even early years, it looks good, the trajectory looks really good. I'm more focused on Key Stage 5, it's also my background. Just looking at that disparity between Hillingdon and maybe our statistical neighbours and the rest of England, I'm just trying to think of reasons why that could be as well. One of the things I was looking at is do we have the right course provision in the borough, where our sixth formers can access the right courses for their skills? Sometimes you get a case of students taking subjects that they don't have the right skills for. They struggle with it, and then that shows the sort of...
It's a very good point, and I think it's something that is constantly under review in terms of the offer that is available to the students. I know it's something that Michael works very, closely with our post-16 coordinator on, and the fact that you have that blend of academic with more, vocational opportunities for the children. I think getting the blend of opportunity for the students is crucial, because that is all about then intrinsic motivation and a wanting to learn and a desire to learn. And I think you raise a very good point, and I think it's something that is constantly under review and being adapted as time goes on.
Yeah, just following up with that, I think sometimes the minimum grades required to do a certain A level in some places are very low, and so that can contribute to that sort of grade, because I think we're shortchanging some of our higher achieving kids, because AAB is a typical sort of Russell Group offer, isn't it? So we're really giving them sort of less opportunities with that side. But with some of the data, I was looking at, we're comparing ourselves to statistical neighbours and outer London. I was thinking, can we compare our students to themselves based on the sort of value added we give them? Can we put that sort of metric in there where we can see what they were predicted to get and how much value we've added to their education through their time in education?
People could somewhere along the line do that and press a button and out it comes. Value added measures are a common measure in education, and they're also a measure that I think at times tells you a great deal more than straight top line attainments as well. So I'm sure that if we asked the data team, we could get something like that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Little?
Thank you. As always, this is a very comprehensive document, and there are questions over all parts of it that we could ask and could keep going for most of the evening, and I realise that nobody will have the time and patience to allow me to ask all of mine. Never mind everybody's. I have got a question, but before doing so, I wanted to reinforce Councillor Gill's point that the move towards more academic A-levels has probably had a negative effect in the availability of less academic courses, and certainly the school where I'm a governor, they're having difficulty with getting level 2 type courses and level 3 type courses that they can practically put on for the students who want them. But that wasn't my question. I wanted to look at exclusions and suspensions, which is pages 109 and 110 and 111, and to ask whether you can confirm or otherwise my suspicions that there is a bias in these that students from deprived backgrounds and certain ethnic groups will be overrepresented in these statistics. That's the first one. I've got a second one, but I think it's a separate question.
I'll take the question on exclusions because it falls into my area. We don't have the data to hand about the disproportionality in regards to ethnicity and social economic background in the paper. I do have the data, so I can get that to you after this meeting.
Thank you. And secondly, as always, and thankfully, exclusions is quite a small number to provide anything in the way of meaningful statistical analysis, and I recognise that. In other industries, and I was thinking about aircraft, where they have a well-developed analysis of crashes, but in addition, near misses. Do we have any sort of equivalent for permanent exclusions? Because I suspect that broader data set would be a much better indicator of the conditions within school relating to, in this case, behavioural type issues.
Yes, we do. So what we're doing in the exclusions area, we're really developing the data set that we have because we want to look at some of that softer analysis that we haven't had previously. It's always been quite crude data. This is the number of exclusions you've had. This is the number of suspensions you've had. So this academic year, what we've been working on is particularly those children where they're on the road to exclusion, and my team are involved trying to avoid that happening so it never gets to the end of the line. At the moment, we're working on an average of about 30 children are being worked with at any one time to avoid exclusions. And what we're also trying to do is make sure we comprehensively capture the number of exclusions that we either retract and or support schools to rescind as well, because further evidence comes to light, or we help the school to understand that actually other alternatives are available rather than going to a permanent exclusion. But it is a new data set that we're working on for this academic year, so it's not present in this report for last year.
Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you, Chair. 2 points. One, we don't have it in hand, it would just be interesting to know in the last 10 years the improvement, the amount of good and outstanding schools that we have in both primary and secondary, as in I know nationally we've moved from 68% to 90%, which is a fantastic achievement and is only possible down to the brilliant work of our teachers and our schools. I'd be interested to see what that statistic is for Hillingdon. But the other question is around statistical neighbours. I've seen what statistical neighbours are, and I get that you have to put a metric in at some point, otherwise you won't get it. But I'm uncomfortable with actually that being something that we necessarily can measure ourselves with, as a stick to beat ourselves with. I'm not actually very comfortable with it, given what is in Hillingdon, Heathrow Airport, right? Given the amount of transient pupils that we have within this borough. So actually, I think whilst we are statistically low, I think we actually need to remember where Hillingdon is within that, and the amount of changing. And Councillor Sweeting talks about it passionately a lot, and the amount of pupils that we have coming in and out of schools. I'm not so convinced that those others have that kind of change within their schools. I don't know for a fact, but I'm just guessing they don't have one of the world's largest airports stuck in their borough, just as an example. So I'm just a little bit conscious that when we are doing this comparison of statistical neighbours, whilst it is important to have it there, we don't necessarily use it as the tool to beat ourselves with, because I think there is other factors at play that you can't build in to a bunch of statistics.
Yeah, just to say, I think that's good advice. I think whenever we're looking at data, it's about just benchmarking, and I think that's why we kind of present it with the Outer London data as well as statistical neighbours as well as national, because all of those give a slightly different perspective and comparator. And it's about, really, for us, it's about where are we compared to where we were. That's our really important information, and how we're improving and building on everything that we've got, and strengthening our skills across the borough to make sure that we have really good outcomes. So I think all of it we take with a pinch of salt. I think particularly post-COVID, and I don't want to keep going on about COVID because it does feel quite historical now already, but that impact is still in the system. And so some of that data that comes out, there's still lots of different anomalies coming through. So there isn't that same consistent sort of data that we used to deal with where we could see really clear trends. But as we talked about before, kind of progress data is really important, because that's the bit that our amazing school staff have a big impact with, is the children that over time they can work with. And to just keep building on what we're doing. We use things like Hillingdon Learning Partnership to really shape the direction of travel with what our priorities are, and that's very much schools working with schools. There's always going to be more work to do, and we're going to keep striving to achieve the highest outcomes we can. But we've just got to look at all these comparators as just another piece of information to give context, really.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
Just the point about statistical neighbours is what Ofsted recognise. I mean, and statistical neighbours are chosen very carefully, but it's what Ofsted use. I'm looking at page 102, another page number being 30, and that's the send casework, which we've got some problems with the 2022 and 2023. Have things improved since then? We've dropped from 86.7% the last 2 years with 66%. And then I'm particularly concerned about the closing of the gap. It's mentioned various times about needing to do more to close the gap between our disadvantaged and our mainstream. And really, what's the council doing? I mean, I know they're doing a lot, but it would be good to have it spelt out, please.
So around the casework, it's still something that we're working on, along with everything else in SEND that we're kind of trying to improve all together. At the moment, we're probably around a similar sort of level as you see in this report, which is not where we want to be. But a lot of that is around, we've been working through lots of challenges we've had with data. So what we're working to now is a much more accurate data set, and we're working on building data dashboards so that we can monitor this information live and really focus our improvements clearly using that data. So there's more work to do around that. The point around disadvantaged, I think this is going to be really key in our education strategy. This is really important for our borough, is looking at disadvantage and all the different meanings that disadvantage kind of covers. It's quite a broad spectrum. So this will be part of our education strategy, where we'll be working with our schools as partners to understand how we can work together to improve those outcomes, because it's going to be a key strand of our strategy.
I think it is, and has been for some time in education, one of the main drivers for interrogation and focused work for schools is to actually help pupils that are classed as disadvantaged, because obviously, as we all know, disadvantage as such in terms of whatever the metrics will label you as such is a huge burden, and it shouldn't be. And it's one of the prime movers in actually working effectively with schools. is to monitor closely their work with the children that are classed as disadvantaged, and how the additional support that schools offer for these children is put into the system and how effective it is. Because, you know, in terms of poverty, as we all know, and you know, expectation, the whole thing has a vicious cycle and a repeating sort of intergenerational impact. I go back to my days as a head teacher, and I can think of numerous cases of intergenerational issues that arose through this label of disadvantage, and it's very much down to schools to identify that accurately, and then with the, obviously the council support, put in place what is needed for those children. So as Abby says, I think it is going to be very much a prime, you know, mover and a central pillar to the council strategy moving forward.
Thank you. Councillor Hagar?
Thank you. I'm still at the beginning of the... bit of feedback going on there. I'm stood at the beginning of the report, so I can go back to page 79. And I really like it when we've got a good report and we're picking up the challenges. To me, that shows a good report. And we're looking at the minders in the early years. You know, I'm reading this and I'm seeing that we've got less childminders coming in. We've got a high turnover of early years. And I just wondered, are we concerned about this? That's my first question. And the second question, I can see what we've done is we've noted the challenges. We're thinking, okay, we're going to support them. So these are the things that we've got on offer, which is on page 80. Have we asked the child, I'm sure we have, but have we asked the childminders and the early years staff what it is, why, you know, they're lacking, why we're not getting them through, why there's a high turnover? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I can give you my take on that one, Councillor. Okay. There is an issue around appropriate staffing in early years and the way that early years is perceived in an educational environment. I've done some work for the DFE around the NPQ EYL course, the Early Leadership course, and although it is classed as a leadership national professional qualification, the actual content of that is not what you could say is comparable to, say, the senior leadership qualification or the headship qualification. There is an issue around, I think, how we as society perceive early years, which is, again, personal view, completely cockeyed and short-sighted. Because, you know, you get it right, as, you know, the PISA data will tell you, in the early years, you have improved outcomes at 16 and 18 across any country that you really want to talk about that has the systems in place. Yeah. So I think there's an issue around perception. I think there's an issue around, you know, training available to staff in early years settings and access to that training, and that leadership journey for staff that actually want to take early years leadership and lead it and pull it. And I think there's an issue around that as well. Obviously, you know, I don't want to get bogged down in the whole funding agenda, but the budgetary pressures are immense. They're huge, and will continue to play a part in any performance issue for the next conceivable time, in my opinion, again.
Mr. Little.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the gap between disadvantaged and other pupils. Would I be right in supposing that the pandemic had an impact in that the pupils who started with an economic disadvantage, the pupils who started with health disadvantages and other disadvantages of expectations, say from parents, were particularly badly hit by the pandemic in terms of holding back those kinds of students from achieving because they weren't at school, because we were all not where we should be. And because of that, do we need to change the approach to closing the gaps so that techniques that worked in the past need to be modified to cope with these revised circumstances?
Yeah, in essence, I'll just say yes, you're completely right for what you've said, so that they were hardest hit for all those reasons that you've just spelled out. The techniques that we need to look at, I'll draw you to something that was called the recovery curriculum, which was very much put in place post-pandemic in schools, because there was this feeling that the children would come into schools having had 2 years of isolation, and in particular the younger children staring at adults with masks on in those really key, crucial developmental times in their lives. And sadly, I think that's a big knock-on effect to what we're seeing in terms of the extreme behaviour that we're seeing exhibited from some of the children at the moment. And that recovery curriculum looked at the whole thing around how to actually reinforce the reintegration of the children post-pandemic. And I think it was an extremely well thought of curriculum and well meant. However, did it hit where it needed to hit in terms of the actual support that the government thought it was going to provide for the children? That I am less confident about, because when I can only draw it back to my own experience as a head teacher leading the school through the pandemic and having children come back in to school after the pandemic. Within the first 4 or 5 days of them coming back, us having them rolled out all this support, particularly geared at the children classed as disadvantaged, they were saying, when are we getting back to the maths? When are we getting back to our literacy? When are we doing what we used to do? Because that whole idea of support and development, they found security in their routines that they had pre-pandemic, and they wanted to return to normality. I don't think it's until the last year or so, with the huge increase in challenging behaviour that some of our children are now sadly showing, that we are starting to see the true impact of that pandemic. And I think in one way it may be too early to say, do we need to adjust our methodology and our strategical view on that, because I think we might have to just let it run for a little longer. Again, this is purely a personal view, but again, I'll draw myself back to the point I made earlier. It's about working really closely with schools and looking at the provision schools have got, using the best models of support where schools are having effective impact, working with the children classed as disadvantage, and using that and the transferable nature of those strategies with other schools.
I just want to raise a point which you talked about, obviously the impacts of COVID, but I noticed that in the report it says that Hillingdon has one trained professional in terms of mental health in each school, which is really good news, and I'm hoping that level of support will ensure that the young people are getting that support, that outlet, someone to talk to, and help them kind of move forward onto the next stage. Yes. Absolutely, it's a start, and I guess that's positive.
It is
step.
Positive. It is positive. Going forward, again, and I'm sure it will play a figural part in the strategy. Mental health, not only for the children support, but it's also staff in school, is crucial at the moment. It is vital, because if your staff in school go down, then the whole system crumbles. So I don't feel, that you can underplay that in any shape or form.
Absolutely, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
It's page 16 and 17. This is all about the in-year fair access panel. Now, from anecdotal evidence I've got from residents moving into the borough, especially in areas such as Hayes, West Drayton, Newsley, etc., they have found it increasingly difficult, especially in a certain age group, a year group, to find a school near to their house which is available. And so am I right in thinking that in-year access panel is being used more and more for move-ins rather than the special cases such as asylum seekers, etc. Because that's my experience that I'm having from some of my residents that are moving in. I mean, certainly, if you look at page 16 and the chart there, you see where the pressure is. The pressure is on secondary, the pressure is in the south. So I know some of those would be asylum seekers, it would be youngsters in the airport hotels and hotels near in my ward. But I'm seeing more and more that youngsters are having to wait longer for any place in a secondary school. And I think it's because we're coming back to this lack of wriggle room. I mean, I've spoken to officers about this as well. And although I don't want to mention names, we seem to have a problem here. So your comments on whether the in-year fair access panel is being used more and more for move-ins.
I can respond. Just say, the fair access panel has clear criteria that it has to follow, so it wouldn't be used just for move-ins. We do monitor those places. We are able to place children generally well. There's always some more challenging cases to do with location, but we do have capacity in the south throughout the year. I think the biggest challenge is the year 11 placements, which are particularly challenging for our schools, and can have an impact because they're coming in so late. So we are looking at potential solutions, working with our secondary schools around what we could offer to alleviate some of that pressure, because that's probably the most challenging part for our schools. But we generally do have the places to be able to place them, and there's a level of mobility, so that allows space as the panels need to place. But any cases you'd like to raise, please share them with me offline.
Yes, one in particular, because I had to go back and talk to admissions about it, because I had information on the spare capacity in that year, not quite recently, and then a move-in was saying, well, no, I can't get a place in that school. So I think there was an issue with one particular school.
Okay, please let me have details and we'll look into it.
Just on the back of that, Abby, Hillingdon's interim provision, can you explain a bit more about what that looks like, please?
I'll have to refresh my mind of the details, but it's essentially a short-term provision to support our children that arrive in the borough and don't have a school place straight away. So that's used well and flexibly to meet needs. We have a number of places, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head how many there are now, but we use that well, and that supports the children that need education so that they're not going without the education whilst waiting for a school place.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Hager?
Yes, thank you. I've moved on a little bit now, further forward, you'll be pleased to know on the report. There's just so much, isn't there? I mean, it's just amazing, there's so much. But I was really pleased, and it's just a comment really, I was really pleased when I read page 94 and page 22 of the report. And we're coming on to outcomes for vulnerable children and young people, and that we're actually looking into the suspension and how we can actually reduce that. And I thought that was really positive going forward, and really a good way of looking, at actually what's happening. So I'd be really interested to hear how we get on with that and what we're putting in place. So it's more of a comment. Can I just ask a question though to go? I'm going right the way through now, and this is really my last question, but coming right to the end now of the report, page 105, children missing education. So I was just trying to get an idea of what the figure was that we've got with actually children that aren't in education. And I suppose that was my question, and how we are monitoring that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So children missing education is in my remit. So our typical average at the moment is anywhere between 120 and 140 children, which is significantly lower than what we've had in previous years. We've had quite a lot of investment in this area. We've done a lot of work on our CME, so we have been able to bring them down. Next year's report, I hope, will be even more positive. But you'll see generally from the figures where we tried to show that on average we are receiving less in now than what we're closing, which is really, really positive, and that number does continue to go down month on month.
Okay, Councillor Judge.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back to mental health. I mean, I believe some of it has been answered. I'm aware of its importance, and I just wanted to know whether the DFE grant, will continue through. Are there provisions, for it to continue?
No, as it stands, it was a one-off grant. So when we made plans around that, it was very much to look at what's going to have the longest term impact with the funding that we had. There are various schemes, training schemes for schools to take part in around mental health, to continue that sort of professional development. But as Rich has talked about already, mental health just underpins everything that we're doing at the moment. And it's, as Rich said, at every point, it's our children, it's our staff, it's our families as well. And it's really, really important that that is interwoven into anything that we do. We do have really good work going on with the mental health support teams that are in our schools. So I can't remember what number wave we're on now, but when I was here previously, we started up the project with working with CAMS and our health providers, and we now have an increasing number of schools that have access to that support. And that's really important because what they do is provide support to the children that wouldn't qualify, if you like, for CAMS support. So it's about trying to meet need in school through professionals that are trained to support those children before needs escalate. But I still think there's a lot more to do, and that's where the impact of COVID really is quite long-lasting, and we're seeing it in all sorts of different ways with our children and families. So that continues to be a priority. But as it stands as a council, we don't get any more funding.
Okay. I noticed, I've lost my page numbers now, but I noticed that there is a creation of EBSA leaflet, and I wonder if we can see that as part of our select committee review. I don't know, Catherine, do you know what I'm talking about? I've read it somewhere, but I can't find the page number.
I'm not sure it was in my section. It might be in the educational psychology section, because I know they've been doing a lot of work on EBSA, so I can speak to them and see what we can do. I do have some literature in the virtual school, but I don't think I included it in the report, so I think it's the EPs.
Yeah, I just think maybe that might be relevant to kind of what we're looking at in the review, so that would be really helpful. I have another couple of questions. It's just about understanding some of the terminology. I'm not sure I understand what September guarantee means, if anyone can help me with that.
That would be me. So the September guarantee is where we need to guarantee that every child in year 11 is able to have a place in further education when they get to 16 to 18. So we need to make sure it's about placement sufficiency, essentially, and making sure that everybody has somewhere onwards to go to, and they don't end up not in education, employment and training or need.
Okay, great. And another one is just looking at the elective home education graph. What does philosophical reasons mean?
It's a very woolly term, but there's certain schools of thought that some parents can sort of attribute what they want for their children to. So where they wouldn't follow a linear path in terms of education would be seen as slightly different to what we would expect, but it's quite a catch-all term. There are specific schools, I can't remember any of them off the top of my head, but there are individual schools of thought that parents will quote and say this is the school of thought that we're wanting to follow for our children, and that's why we're withdrawing from mainstream education.
Okay, fair enough, thank you. Mr. Little.
Sorry, something you said reminded me, as a plea to officers on this report, could we have a list of the acronyms and what they mean? Some get explained in the text, but some of them don't. And I know they're the sort of everyday life to you, but to us they're not.
Yeah, I think with the agenda item 5, I think the school organisation plan, there is a whole section which is great, but I feel like there will be another acronym emerging with SOP or something. Do you use that already? No? Okay. Yeah, there you go. All these acronyms. Any other questions or comments before we wrap this one up? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for joining us this evening. So just going back to the recommendations again, I believe we need to submit comments on the report. So thank you. We'll make sure we do that. Thank you, Nav. Okay, so we move on now to agenda item 7, which is the persistent absenteeism review and our first witness session. Catherine?
Thank you, Chair. I've just put together a brief update for councillors just so that you can see what the current picture is looking like in terms of persistent absenteeism. So I included some data in the academic year to date. You can see that we're currently at around 19.5%. The national average at the same time was 20.6%, so I'm pleased we are slightly lower, which is different to where we were last year. However, I did some calculations and I did work out that if we continued on this trajectory, we would round out the year at around 26 to 28% if we continue on this trend, which is still higher than we'd like, but equally lower than where we were last year at almost 34%. So I think we're already starting to see the positive impact of some of the work that we've been able to do. I did also include some very preliminary data for you there in the more vulnerable categories of our children and what their rates of persistent absenteeism are. My plan is hopefully to pull together a much deeper report into that. That was just to give you some highlights, so I don't have much more than that at this stage, but we will do in the coming months, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then lastly, just to talk about some of the things that we have been doing since November to try and move this agenda forward. So we have brought in a revised borough-wide protocol, which has been published now for all of our schools to use in terms of penalty notices when we have children who are being taken out for exceptional leave. We will have to revise that again because literally 2 weeks ago, I think it was, the government revised the guidance again. They've increased penalties. I'm sure you may have seen that in the news. So now we're going to have to be charging more and other things have changed. So it's a very changeable landscape at the moment, but I think it's all positive for us. I think it shows that what we've chosen for scrutiny is being scrutinised everywhere. So it's a good thing overall, just a little bit more work for us to do. We've done lots of training. We've done the EBSA training for all of our team members, lots of colleagues across the local authority, and also been offered to key colleagues in schools as well. So they've all attended that. We have 4 members of the attendance support team, Sally of which is one of them, who are now doing training for working with children with complex trauma. That's a 7-day training course that takes place over 6 months. It's very in-depth. It's done by a very specialist company. And will help, I think, our team to really think about those families where there are lots of adverse childhood experiences, there's intergenerational trauma, and how do we start to tackle that, and how is that linked to potential persistent absenteeism. We've now launched our attendance hubs. In Hillingdon, we're calling them clusters. So we've had them so far in West Drayton, Hillingdon and Ruislip, and we have another one planned for later this academic year, where we're getting clusters of schools together to talk about common issues, to think about how we can tackle them together. It's still very much a work in progress, but it's been a positive thing so far to get like-minded people from the schools together to really think about what are the problems, how can we work together, what's good practice that one person has that somebody else could share, for example. So we're really pleased that that's going well. And then finally, the 2 things that I'm most excited about are the 2 project managers that we now have, or will have. I have one in the virtual school who is really looking at our work with children with a social worker. So she's been recruited for 12 months. She's into her 3rd month now. And I'm just now advertising for a 12-month education project manager who's going to focus on attendance. And I really want to use both of them to do that deep dive analysis that I spoke about into the data, because we have data, we're quite data rich. What we don't have is intelligence, and I think that's the bit that we're missing, and at the moment we just haven't quite got that capacity to pull that together. So I hope in the next couple of months, some of the lines of inquiry that we have for our scrutiny, I can use those project managers to really follow down those rabbit holes and see where we get to and what we can actually do. So yeah, open to questions.
Great, thank you. Sounds quite positive. Good start. So Mr. Little.
Thank you, and thank you for the extra analysis that you've provided. Could I test your statistical indulgence a bit further. And that is, I've got two questions. One relates to the extra information you've provided us about the vulnerable cohorts. And to my mind, that suggests that it would also be useful to have some sort of geographical analysis. Right? The two things are quite strongly correlated within the borough, and I think it would be helpful for us to kind of envisage what it looks like across the borough. And the second one relates to what you were saying earlier about the changes in the penalties. Could we have kind of a little further historical analysis of the numbers of penalties and types of penalties, if there are types, that we have applied over whatever reasonable period you have, and secondly, the information about the numbers of officers that are employed in this area. You've got 8, I think you say now, but is that what we've always had, or is that a big increase in what we've always had?
So in terms of penalty notices, that will be a big feature of the report that I'm going to ask the project manager to pull together. There are 2 types of penalty notice, so we can issue for a holiday essential penalty notice, or we can issue for non-attendance. So we can definitely pull that data together and show you a historical picture of how much we're issuing, because that is a big part actually of our persistent absenteeism, because we issue a lot in particular of holiday penalty notices. So that's absolutely fine. In terms of the size of the team, it has remained very similar over the years, but the team itself and what it looks like, its functions have changed. So what this team previously was called the participation team, so people who've been around a bit longer, and we used to have other functions that were under us, including children missing education, tracking of children not in education, employment and training, child performance licences. There was lots of different things that were under this umbrella. One of the things that we've done in the last 18 months is taken some of those services out and made them more discreet, and this service is now solely focused on attendance support so that we can really drive this agenda forward.
And geographical analysis?
Yes, I can definitely include that for you.
Yeah, thank you. And just on the back of the fixed penalty notice, penalty notices, it'll be interesting to understand if they are really effective as well. Does it really make a difference in terms of absenteeism rates as well? So I guess that data that you'll provide and that analysis will help us to understand that picture too. Thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
Just one general comment that I remembered that one of my head teachers and governor of 2 schools asked, where does the penalty money go? Does it come back to us as schools, or does it go into some sort of pot somewhere? So that was just a general question, but also it would have been really interesting to be a fly on the wall on one of these attendance hubs to actually see the interaction between head teachers and what they were coming, information they were coming. Now I know that we can't attend, but I don't know whether we can just get notes of the one in Hayes that's forthcoming, because that might well inform our discussions when we start to look at the detail of our major review. I mean, it would be great to be able to sort of listen in, because it's our heads that have got the answers and have got the questions as well.
No, absolutely. We can definitely get you some sort of summary at least of what was discussed and asked about, really. Yeah.
And where does the money go,
so the money, so the money does come back into the council, but that essentially pays for the penalty notice officer that we have who administers all of this work, and it is quite a significant piece of work and involves prosecutions and lots of legal paperwork, so it's where, and actually it doesn't even cover all of his roles, so yeah, that's where it comes back to.
Okay, Councillor Hager.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, really good to hear about what's actually happening, and like you said, Chair, really positive. Also, I was looking into actually, the absenteeism, but then also about them coming back. How do we make it easier for the child to come back? And I don't know, but I would say some of that might be the apprehension in returning back to school, whether they can manage it, and those sorts of things. So I'd like to see a little bit of that. I'm sure we will in the report, but yeah, thank you.
Do you mean coming back after an absence, or coming back maybe at the start of the school year, just to be sure?
No, after an absence. So if it's a long absence, they come back and then they're finding they can't cope, so they're off again, and then they can't, that, it's sort of like a bit of a ping pong, isn't it, really? Back, not in, and how we can support the child in coming back.
Yeah, I think what we are seeing in the data is there's almost two cohorts really of our persistent absentees, because there are those children where they'll have a significant portion off and then they need to come back, and how do we support them to reintegrate essentially. But there's also a bigger group where it's ad hoc days that build up over time. So I think I've quoted to you before that on average to be a persistent absentee, you're off one day a fortnight every, across the year. And that's what we see is more difficult to tackle, because it's just they've phoned in one day because there's maybe been a sniffle, the next week it was a toothache, there's lots of, and that's more tricky. So when we get more of this data analysis, it will be interesting, I think, to see how we can tackle those, because I think they are more difficult than the longer term absences. I think that's more clear cut into how we can support them to reintegrate.
Councillor Banerjee.
Just the issue on like fines and penalties. You don't inadvertently want to be sort of like penalising the most vulnerable children or the families that are having difficulties. Is any consideration given to those sort of issues before obviously fines issued? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, and that's definitely within the new working together guidance, that we do need to consider all of the context around the child and the family situation. What is important, though, to point out is that the decision to issue the penalty is actually the school's decision. We just act on their behalf. We issue the penalty. What we can do, though, is hear an appeal in some instances where a parent feels there have been mitigating circumstances, or there's evidence that they feel they haven't submitted that should be considered, and we can think about that and decide whether or not there is grounds to withdraw the penalty. But really the decision to issue lies with the head teacher of the school. We are just the people that issue it, if that makes sense.
We don't go down the route of using debt collection agencies or anything like that. Nothing that severe.
No, we don't use debt collection agencies.
No, so if they don't want to pay the penalty, there's not really much we can do, or
we can take them to court and prosecute legally if we choose to, and we feel it's in the public interest to do so.
Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to focus on one particular type of absenteeism that I call EasyJet absenteeism, or the Ryanair absenteeism, depending on if you live in my ward, British Airways. I just wondered what we do to educate parents, because I think there's an awful lot of, even some of my friends do it, they're like, it don't really matter if we take them out 3 days before, the flights are £400 cheaper. And all they do is watch videos and, play on the last couple of days. It don't really matter, does it? We've heard those conversations that all happen, and we actually know that we've moved away from that kind of thing, and actually, the government's actually, in the last few years has firmed up on things like that. So I just wondered how we educate parents on the importance of keeping their children into school, and that just saying 2 days here and 2 days there actually does have an impact on their children's future.
I think that's going to form part of the wider government initiative at the moment. Every moment counts, attendance counts. It's why they've risen the amount of penalty notices that you now have to pay, because it is a problem nationally. And as you say, there has been in some instances an ethos of, well, it's still cheaper to pay the fine than it is to go on holiday a couple of days earlier. It's very difficult to challenge that issue, because we are where we are with the travel industry. I think we need to think about, as a local authority, how do we work with our schools to really to move away from this ethos of, well, at the end of the term they just watch videos. I don't think that's true in our schools, but how do we make sure that actually our parents and our children understand that that's not the case, and that every day does count, every lesson does matter, and that time out, it's not just the impact of the lessons, it's also the social impact. I mean, I remember being at school and having a couple of days off, and you missed your friends, you'd missed all the gossip, you didn't know what had happened, and that makes it harder to come back sometimes, to go back to your question. So I think I don't have the answer just now, but I think there is a piece of work that we do need to do with our schools in trying to change that ethos slightly, and making sure that everybody feels like attendance matters and it's everyone's business.
Thank you very much. Great answer. Just leading on from Councillor Banerjee's point earlier, what is the percentage of fines completed? So what is the percentage of fines paid against not paid?
I don't have that data to hand, but I can get it to you.
Thank you. And would you be able to report that back in a future meeting? Thank you.
Mr. Little.
Thank you. My point was also on interaction with parents, but more in the case of persistent rather than early holidaying parents, where there's persistent absence. Is there a programme of engagement with parents and an education of parents separate from the sort of thing that might go on in the individual child case?
There is, but it is individualised to each school, and it will depend on their context and what's relevant to their parents and their families. So every school can take a child and their parents to the attendance panel process, and that's meant to be a supportive mechanism. So the attendance support officer will support with that process. They'll meet with the child, with the family, with the school, and discuss and try and get down to what is the issue here, what's the barrier, and how do we all collectively work together to address those issues. An agreement is then made, the support is then put in place, whether it's training. We can refer to external providers from the third sector, like Brilliant Parents, for example, to get some support for parents as well as for the child, what's happening in school. And there'll be a set time frame at which everybody has to adhere to that plan to try and improve that child's attendance.
I'm sure this is very valuable and important work, working with the individual child and understanding the circumstances, so I'm not knocking that at all. It's hugely important. But is there not also a case for a more generalised instilling in some types of parents the value of education, returning to something that was said earlier about intergenerational deprivation because of poor expectations of children? And there doesn't seem to be a mechanism anywhere where you can get round that. Nobody sees it as their function that we need to value education so that those who would actually most benefit from it actually realise it's in their interest.
I will gently challenge that, actually. I do feel like I do take that quite seriously within my role, and what we do, though, I think it's very difficult to influence change in parents' mindsets. What it is possible to do, though, is to interrupt the intergenerational cycle, and so the work that we try to do is with the child, because that's where we can have the influence. We have those children in school for 5-6 hours a day, 5 days a week. If you can interrupt that cycle with them, that's where it's going to be really most powerful.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to be critical of you or your role, but I would counter that, saying if you've got them 5 hours a day, the parents have got them the other 19, and I suspect the parents have more influence more broadly over their children directly than anybody from outside. And again, that's not in any way intended to be critical of the influence that you do have. But it does argue that there needs to be a broader programme targeted at certain areas that tries to enhance the way in which education is viewed by the sorts of parents who've tended to miss out on it themselves and pass that on. And that sort of work doesn't have anybody, it seems to me, to be projecting it.
I think that's something that we can potentially try to address through the clusters that we've brought together, because they are geographically based, they're location based, so we can think about where are those particular areas that we need to target. We have those schools now building those networks together as a cluster with the support of our team, and then we can think about, okay, so do we need to come together as a group and put on some training, or to bring together parents and families as one? Are there particular cohorts that we need to target, or schools in that way? So I think that we do now have some mechanisms whereby we can explore those issues that weren't there previously. We didn't have clusters, we weren't thinking in that collective way and in a geographical way. I think that's something that we will see come out over the next couple of months as that initiative grows.
I think as well as that, it's about the different teams across the council that have contact with our families all singing from the same song sheet. And I think Catherine's team do an amazing job with everything they're doing, but it's not up to their team alone to kind of win this fight, if you like. And I think they're doing a really good job at making sure the different teams in the council that have contacts with families and schools are also supporting that agenda. So it might be Stronger Families, key workers working with families and supporting that attendance, but all the different teams kind of working together. So it's about a collective response from us and our communities and kind of doing everything we can to have a big impact.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments, Councillor Sweeting?
It's just looking at the review planning and timetable. I don't know whether we've got any answers to officers from the other local authorities that might be rocking up to our next meeting. And where are we with schools coming back to us? I mean, I'm particularly concerned that we're talking about June and July, which might not be an easy time for our schools, but I am concerned that we are going to get the voice of our schools and the other local authorities that may well have a magic bullet that they can share with us.
Ryan, do you have any update on this by any chance? Not at the moment, okay. All right, it is something that I was going to raise as well, so I think that we'll just keep the dialogue going and make sure that we try to get as many witnesses and we don't miss out on these sessions. Any other questions or comments? No, great. We can bring this agenda item to a close. Thank you, Catherine, Sally and Abby. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're moving on then to agenda item 8, which is the minutes of the corporate parenting panel. Do we agree the minutes? Agreed. Fantastic. We move on to agenda item 9. Any questions or comments for the forward plan? Councillor Sweeting?
Just I'd like to see sight of any comments that we make to Cabinet on both the reports that we've had before us this evening.
Okay. Agenda item 10, work programme. Any questions or comments on the work programme? Councillor Sweeting?
What we haven't had with our school planning of places report is an up-to-date audit of how the current admission round has gone. Now we know we had the offer day on the 1st of March and parents will be accepting or not accepting places as of tomorrow. But having information from 2 parents for the very first time, I had one parent who was offered a second preference of a previously well and truly oversubscribed secondary school, and the same with another. So things are moving in a certain direction. So I was wondering for our next meeting if we could just have information on how the current admissions round is going, to look at how many year 7, how many reception, what does that mean about the wriggle room in our secondaries. I know I keep on using that phrase, but never mind. And then the surplus places. It would also be useful if we could also just have where we are with unfilled places, particularly in our secondaries. So how many places in, not particularly year 7 because that would be included, but year 8 and year 9. I know one particular year group is very tight, so if that could be included as well. So it's just where we are with the current admissions round and where we are with unfilled places in our secondary schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, any other questions or comments before we bring the meeting to a close? No, great, thank you. Thank you all very much for your contributions. I know it was quite a bit of a meaty agenda this time round, but thank you once again and safe journey home.